I'm always bopping out to the music that I create for the shows. It feels a little embarrassing sometimes. Hey, everybody. So, in a world where machines think, what happens when they are thinking? We, on the Daily AI Show, talked about the new paper from Anthropic, the biology of, this is where I need to make sure that I have the paper. Sorry. The what is the name of the paper? Andy, tell me the name of the paper.
I don't know. Uh, I'll have to look it up.
Okay. Yes, thank you. We will. Yes. So, blah, 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 blah. Thanks, everybody. So glad to have you with us. This is just where it's gonna go. Apparently, now I have to find the thing again. Hey, yes. Da, 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 da. Hey. So, in a world where machines think and AI is becoming our ubiquitous pal, we are starting to investigate what happens when AI is thinking, right? So, what happens when thoughts form potentially without consciousness? Or are they now forming with consciousness? There are various things that in the science fiction world have to tell us about this experience. Welcome to the SciFi AI Show. We explore how the future we imagined is suddenly very real. I'm your host, Beth Lyons, and today we are asking some very interesting, deep questions. With me today is my inimitable partner, Jyunmi Hatcher, and Andy Halliday, our emeritus, our co-host emeritus. I don't know. Um, so the
So,
thought, the question is, what's the name of the paper?
well, the paper is on the subject of interpretability of large language models, which are deep neural networks, technically, and our brains are deep neural networks. And so the paper is about tracing the thoughts of large language models.
Right.
And what they're doing is discovering ways to determine what the step-by-step process of interactions among these many artificial neurons are in a deep neural network in order to see what its thought process is. And this we discovered in our show on the Daily AI Show on this subject is actually evocative of understanding how our own brains, our wet neural networks, actually process thought. So that's the
Awesome.
subject of today.
So the one of the questions we're asking is what happens when the language that is spoken is not the language that we trained it in, right? That what happens when what we've created has its own language and is able to speak its own language with other uh creations like itself, with other AIs. And one of the things that this is evocative of is the characters from The Arrival. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about science, a philosophy concept called um, the theory of mind, and it was put forth together Mentalese and the theory of mind, the language of thought. So it was a philosopher named Jerry Fodor, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. But hello, Junmi. Hello, Andy. How are you today? What are you thinking about this stuff?
Um, Deep. This is deep stuff. This is the framework of thought and cognitive ability and consciousness and things like that. And so I think I'm based upon our other episode where we were talking about or Das was talking about the Claude papers or the Anthropic papers. It was really in broad strokes, it was an analysis of um, them opening up the black box that is AI and its processes and its thinking processes and things like that, and and their observations of what they were able to see. And one of the big things that I drew from that was um, the process in which Claude 3.5 haiku specifically, the way it goes through um, and finds all the related or interconnected information regarding, like, let's say we're talking about like a specific fact, right? And they use the example of if someone typed in Texas Capitol, right, and they followed its processing to figure out how it got to the answer of Austin. And then the other one that really stood out was the poetry, because when you asked Claude to create a poem, it would identify the key words and concepts of whatever that first line is. And they showed the process of that. It would pre-plan future possible lines for the poem because of the rhyming and interconnectedness of certain words, within that first line. So these were insights into how Claude really goes about its thinking and comes to those conclusions. Now, how that relates to sci-fi and the examples that we've seen there is, like you said, Beth, is Arrival is a great example of something that's completely alien, right? We have no idea, we have no frame of reference for what that language they're trying to communicate or what that form of communication is, right? And so when we see AI, which is fairly foreign to us in the sense of that black box, we have to crack it open and try and follow what's going on there to figure out how is it actually reaching these conclusions. We have to reverse engineer, and that's a lot, and that's primarily what the linguistics characters did in Arrival. Is okay. Well, where do we start with truly alien beings? And I think that was one of the purposes of the story was if we are trying to communicate and interpret a being that is vastly unfamiliar, right? Doesn't look like us, doesn't have any of the same qualities, can't even breathe the same atmosphere. So we have no like base programming or base Rosetta Stone. And essentially that's kind of what they were creating, was the Rosetta Stone, is to translate between our concepts and their concepts, and then teaching them enough of our basic thinking processes to then communicate with us on our level so that we could learn their thinking processes. So that's essentially how cerebral the movie gets, and then we can go into further details of what the big revelations are and things like that. But I think that's the touch point between these ideas. And then you also mentioned Mentalese, and I wasn't too familiar with Mentalese, so I was doing up some readings and things like that, and I can see where that correlation is between um, the findings they found in the Claude research and the concepts in Mentalese. So in broad strokes, Mentalese is the idea that there is an underlying substrate or layer even before language constructs, right? So even before we have English, there is sort of a symbolic grounding points of concepts in this is how our brain translates these things. Now, it's still debated. It's a hypothesis. It's a theory that's debated amongst different linguists and uh, I think neuroscientists and stuff like that, where uh, there's competing theories of how the brain does its space communication. Um, what stood out to me when I was reading up on it a little bit was that we can find sort of a correlation or a what's the word I'm looking for? Um, we can find a facsimile of this in computing, right? When you think about how your desktop computer processes, you could say there's different languages that contain the information in the communication matrices. That's why we call programming languages, right? You're doing C, or you're doing JavaScript, or you're doing, it's a form of having communication standards on whatever level. But if we look at the computer itself, um, the base language, or the base representation of how processes work at the core level, if we associate like the CPU with being our brain, and the motherboard and the other devices are different components, the body, the chassis is, the hard drive is for storage, and so we can do these analogies, then something like Mentalese would be that base layer. They call that assembly. So assembly is the most simple, basic form of language, if you will, communication that runs the smallest components in your computer, right? This
Mhm.
what was that, Andy? You're muted.
Andy, we can't hear
You're
you.
muted.
I'm sorry.
There
I
you
think
go.
you mean, yeah, great. I was just going to say I think that the actual name of that really root level language for the binary operations is assembler, ASSEMBLER.
Well,
Uh,
that's the function, is the assembler. Yes. Um, so so that and there's some crazy stuff you can do with it. It's so simple that well, one of the reasons why they do it is, one, you can control logic gates with it. That's essentially what it's there for. But it you could theoretically, and people have done this, it's crazy that they do, but you can I think I've seen someone make a video game out of that language, and people just like, wow, that's amazing, that took an incredible amount of time, but also it takes the least amount of memory and the least amount of power.
So,
So it's so resource light. That's why it's on the hardware. That's why they use it for the hardware, is because it's incredibly resource light. So we should just build everything in that,
this
and we'll save all of this hardware and energy and all those kinds of things. But then for the average programming team, it may increase their programming time by 1,000 or 10,000 fold, so they don't do it.
well, we're
Um,
going to put a pin in that because aren't we now moving into a situation where perhaps the programming team's time is supplemented by AI?
maybe. I don't think I've seen any examples, and there probably is examples out there, but I have not seen any examples, at least not in the main feeds, of building out in that language, as opposed to, you see tons of Python, there's tons of
Right.
JavaScript, right? Because that's kind of our web layer interaction, where the new hotness, and everything like that is all forms of that. So we can see a ton of that, but I don't think I don't even see a lot of examples of people building in C or C sharp or anything like that. But of course, maybe it's just not the right fit. But I'll
So,
I'll,
so
I'll leave it there.
go ahead,
yeah.
Beth.
Well, I was going to bring you in. So,
I wanted to
so
say,
yeah.
therefore, if I may, I like the idea of there being in the deep neural network a representation that's created which is language independent. And in fact, if you feed pre-training data to a single LLM in multiple languages so that it has this translation capability, the representations occur, in my opinion, statistically in the framework of those multi-layered perceptrons that are in these deep network layers. Those things get codified into certain concept clusters. And when you feed it the other language, again, almost statistically, it's putting them together with the things that are most semantically relevant. And so you have these both in the same area of representation in the deep neural network in a way that we can't fully comprehend. Although the Anthropic research is showing that we can at least follow the trace of the processing in a specific language. But I like the idea of, hey, the machine doesn't depend on a single language. And I want to provide a couple of examples of this in research that's out there. At the end of 2024, Microsoft and the University of Chicago developed a new, more efficient method of communication between large language models called droid speak. And what they did is they allow the LLMs to communicate to each other utilizing a mathematical language that underpins the models rather than the translation into any one of the languages that are also layered on top of those sort of fundamental impressions about what the communication is about. So it allows droid speak, that language allows LLMs to share essential data without burdening themselves with the step of having to inform humans through their native languages. And that reduces the bottleneck of communication that the language model does. We call them language models, but it has its own underlying language that doesn't require translation if it's one LLM talking to a similar LLM with a similar kind of training. And what it was able to do is almost triple the speed at which the communication of the concepts, the underlying mathematical concepts, could be transmitted between those two LLMs. And there's one other that I want to mention, which is recently, and I forget when it was, but we saw a demonstration of an agent-to-agent communication where they were talking in gibberlink mode, which is a protocol where AI agents can communicate audibly to each other over a transmission channel, but that language is unintelligible to humans. And that gibberlink mode was designed to optimize communication efficiency between agents, leveraging sounds just like, the dial-up modems used to do, delivering, the necessary authorization codes for connecting to an internet service through a bunch of bleeps and bloops, just like R2D2 and C3PO could do. So there is a language for these things that doesn't require all the complexities and translations in order to make them intelligible to humans.
Right. And the thought that, like, if you start to really dive deep into the ways that human language is limited, and the sensors of machines are much more fine-tuned, right? So those bits and bops that are being shared between those two units, we see in the video that we can hear the bits and bops. We don't know what we're not hearing in that, but also there's no reason that it couldn't happen outside of the auditory spectrum that a human could hear, right? So that then and like so I'm a musician, we've talked about this before, but when you study world music, places that are not in the West have not just half tones, they have quarter tones, they have things that, because of the way that their music has evolved, they can hear things that a Western ear trained in Western music does not distinguish. Now think about how much you can subdivide that sound or that rhythm or that speed into something that a machine can distinguish, right? With much finer sensors. And now we start to just start to be able to conceive of how I don't know how much we're leaving on the table that could have meaning in it, in that concept.
Another point of information about this is there are certain languages on the planet. Some of them are being lost very quickly as we dominate with the primary languages, Chinese and English. But there are languages that have much more subtle variations around a concept. They have words for, subtle variations around a concept that English doesn't have.
Right.
And so English is more compact in that sense, and it becomes easier to learn it. But there's a lot of ambiguity about certain words. Like when I say, I love it, that's one thing. But if I say, I love you, that's another thing. Right.
Right.
And then there are languages that have, 40 words for love, each with a separate and distinct, nuanced connotation. So we are really dependent on the language that we learn as our primary language, or you know dependent on intense study of another language that has the nuanced variations and words to capture those subtle distinctions between those concepts. uh, we're dependent in our thought process on just how articulate is our language of origin. I can tell you that having studied French and becoming pretty proficient, I would dare say apparently fluent in French back in 1973 when I lived with a French family in France for 3 months. I never ever experienced thinking in French. I was always thinking in my native language, and I got very fast and good at translating it into French. But I understand other distinctions about the phrasings of French, and I wish that certain expressions in French and the grammatical structure of French could be used in English effectively. But again, I think our thought processes are pre-trained. We're trained by the language that exists around us when our brain is being first formed. And this happens at a very young age, right? Before two, that structure of ideas is being formed. And then beyond two, it's being refined as we work in that single language. And we know that you can be multimodal. Your brain in that early stage is very, very plastic. And if you feed it all the languages, it'll understand them all and basically create concept space that includes all the terms across all the languages that apply to that concept.
Mm-hmm.
And that's essentially one of the um, base reasoning why Fodor's Mentalese, that that theory, because if if it's if the human brain can learn all of these languages and early on when it's still developing, well, how does it do that? There's got to be some sort of symbolic links or connections or base conceptualness in the brain that
Mm-hmm.
then makes the interconnections, so the theory goes. So I mean I really like the idea that there is a pre-language layer of communication, and it's our our mental faculties in our brain essentially to make those stronger connections. And what
Mm-hmm.
we see, what an origin language is, like you said, Andy, it's what we're exposed to early on as our brain is forming. So it's a fallback. And normally we don't need to fall further back. But if we could unlock that, if we could open up the switch saying accept anything because we have and we're communicating on that base level, then it becomes easier to absorb all languages and recognize them for the frameworks that they are, as opposed to just the conceptual, the the concepts that we think they represent and things like that. And that goes back to the concepts talked about in the arrival.
So
Is
that's, yeah, because that's one of the things that I want to ask about, um, Junmi, is so what it seems to be that we're seeing is the what happened with the arrival is that there was an intent to communicate. There was like a desire to pass concept, knowledge, intention, something back and forth. And AI doesn't create its own intent to communicate. So it's, yeah, like that piece is just really fascinating to me. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? About the arrival?
Sure, 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 sure. So the big reveal in the arrival, and I apologize if anyone watches this and they haven't seen it yet. Pause now, go watch it, and come back. We'll be here. No, just kidding. But
It's still good. Watch it after you know the
watch it
reveal.
afterward. Yeah. Um, but the big reveal is that the alien species in which humans called heptapods, um, they came, yes, they had the intent to come to Earth to engage with and communicate with humanity because they perceive and interact with time as a language. So that's the big reveal. This heptapod B, what they've called the language of the heptapod, which look like ink, you know, calligraphy kind of stuff, is they discover as the main character, she was trying to teach them human, essentially basic concepts in human, um, at that even lower level than whatever language, you know, when they're all speaking English in the movie. But because it's an international thing, um, it's like, well, how do you communicate who doesn't even understand any of our languages or how we think? So that was the big thing. It's like, teach them how we think, then we can understand their language. And the whole purpose was for them to come here and teach us their language, because through understanding that underlying concept of their communication method, of their language, you can perceive time under the concept that time isn't linear. All time happens all at once. So everything is the present. And it is only because of our limited perception and how we experience time do we have concepts of the past and the future and the present. And so when you learn this language, the caveat is once you learned it and understood it, you can interact and perceive time in the same way, which allows you to pick particular moments. And so the whole reason they did that is there is an event, humans came and saved them from it. So they were coming back in time, which to them was the same time, to engage humans to get us ready so that we could help them survive something which had already happened. Yeah, timey-wimey temporal mechanics stuff going on there. But this is represented in the film by the main character's consciousness essentially being able to shift through what we perceive as different periods in time, sort of creating these causal loops and tying things together so that the best outcome would happen from the perception of those who only perceive time linearly.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I I think that's as accurate as I can make it. But the main takeaways, like for the context of this conversation, is that their language is I wouldn't say complicated. It is at a root level beyond the frameworks or experiences or concepts that we have formed through our various languages over time, which can, people have known, have caused miscommunications, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because of our own understanding of etymology and those kinds of things. Um, but it's at this whole other level that it's beyond just thought, it's time. So it's like even below Mentalese, there's the concept of all time is all at once. And if you can understand how that functions, then and you can perceive it, and your brain can be changed to perceive it without getting in its own way. Going back to superposition and the concept of dark matter, the show, then you can put yourself in any of those positions, any of that time, any of that time period or timeline or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I love this idea, right? And it can go in a bunch of different directions. This is this sort of the essence of meditation as well, right? So that it isn't that you can stop your thoughts, but can you connect to the ways in which you exist without your thoughts, so that the thoughts are um, detached or inconsequential. Uh, you're not so hooked into them. And then how does that change your experience of time, right? So that the time that passes in that state does feel different, does feel really interesting. I remember a Star Trek episode about time. We're not going to talk about time. I'm going to go down a deep rabbit hole. But there was a Star Trek episode of where time, where Picard met somebody who could change the experience of time, so it felt like time was slow in that episode. Anyway, okay, so if we are thinking about words and language and intention and communication, then what is a thought? What what is required to have thought? If it's not reliant on words,
Hmm. What is required to have thought? So
what is a
how are we
thought?
how are we defining thought?
Yeah.
Right? Is there an official definition of thought?
um
Well, while you're working on that definition, let me just say that what my reaction is to that question is that yes, I have nonverbal thoughts, but I can't talk about them because they aren't verbal,
so
right?
it doesn't make very
Uh,
good podcast.
yeah. So it's difficult to express them. But if we think about states of mind where you're simply an observer and you're not, and let's take the dream state for example, where I rarely have the experience of me actually being an acting speaker in a dream. Instead, I'm observing events happening around me. So there are thoughts, and largely they're, I would say, in the character of sentiment. That there are sentiment reactions to the passage of events that I'm observing, so it doesn't require words to have that. I suspect, though I'm not familiar with any such research, that there are people who have had a traumatic brain injury that affects the verbal processing, for their brain, who still nonetheless have rich fMRI results in response to hearing and or seeing, uh, even though they can no longer understand the words. Uh,
Yes,
right.
actually,
So so
and I can.
there's tonality in sound that maybe doesn't require the language processing, and so you can hear distress in a sound, and you can have an emotional reaction to the tonality of a sound. Uh, so I think that there is something nonverbal about the thought process, and when we think about AI and the multimodal AIs that are trained on images without sound, right? So they have the capacity to understand an image without there necessarily being a soundtrack or labeling associated with it. Uh, that is a suggestion that the deep neural network, it has a mechanism that can understand or think about and actually replicate imagery without needing language to superimpose upon that. And we add multimodal training, meaning simultaneous language and image training, to allow us to do text to image, prompt to visualization kind of results from an AI. Why? Because we don't have a way of generating images in our physical form, but we can generate speech.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that that right there is the source of many of my problems because I think in pictures, And there are times you all have been having conversations with me late at night. I need more water because I don't have any words, none
Well,
whatsoever. And if I could just give you the picture that I have in my head, it makes perfect sense. And in fact, the working definition for this, a thought is an internal mental representation or process that involves the manipulation of information, such as perceptions, concepts, memories, emotions, often directed toward understanding, decision making, or imagination. But those are facilitated by words that are understood by the beings around you, whether they speak them or not, right? Like you don't have to, you can just spell TREAT in front of a dog who has understood what is happening, and that becomes the concept as well, right? So it's not dependent on being able to communicate the words, also to be able to understand the concepts that are being communicated.
and I think that's a good way to highlight um, the one of the things that we get out of the Anthropic paper, and we see examples in like Arrival. Um, there was the story of the patient who I forget which research lab it was. Oh, I think it was one of the universities, was able to make another brain computer interface, and uh, they had lost the ability to verbalize, right?
Mm-hmm.
So verbalizing our crude matter has our constructs or our framework to be able to communicate our internal thoughts. And like you said, if we lose that or we make other layers on top of it, that actually prevents us from properly understanding, because it's a way to encapsulate the information from our mind, put it into a package, hand it off through our handshake protocol, which is verbalization is the medium, and then the information is encapsulated, that is transferred to another who uses their language constructs to open up the encapsulation and receive the information. And it's their own internal processing that then interprets that information, right?
Right.
So that's where a lot of the miscommunication happens. And if any of those steps and mechanisms fall or fail, or it doesn't receive the information, doesn't get all the packets, uh, that's where greater and greater miscommunications happen. And the more we try to shortcut or we put on more layers of complexity, the higher chance that the more packets we need to be able to transfer that information. Unfortunately, with the more bandwidth that's required, and we don't have the mechanisms to keep that bandwidth running properly, we start dropping packets, right?
Right. So
Right?
we need our little colossus. Is that what it's called? Right. We need our upgrade data center. I just need plug it
Right.
into my USB port
Well,
right at the neck, and
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. If and what we're seeing from this paper is there's evidence of this kind of mechanism existing in neural networks that we've created, which in part is based off our interpretation of how our neural networks work, right? It's based off of our biology. Then that gives more credence to the idea that there is this base layer, this Mentalese layer, these just symbolic or structural or infrastructure type uh, ideas or systems. So if you could just cut through all of the extra encapsulation, bandwidth, all of this resource memory hog kind of frameworks and get down to the base concepts, then theoretically you could just communicate near instantly from one mind to another. Now, what would be the medium for that? On the metaphysics side, that could be harmonics, that could be electromagnetic field manipulation, other forms of things that electrical fields in general, because of our firing neurons and things like that. And throughout history, there's been different words for them, and so we could take a look at that as, oh, this is how we understood it then. Now we have created our own language for understanding what that concept was.
Hmm.
And we can now work on trying to communicate at that most rudimentary level, which would offer us near perfect, or the idea, anyways, near perfect communication so that we would all understand each other completely.
So this is an interesting concept for me because um, uh, I don't even know if this was brain research or just something, some sort of thought experiment. But the idea that I, if I am perceiving a blue wall and you are also perceiving a blue wall, are we perceiving the same thing, or have we just agreed that the representation that our whatever is going on with us that says that that is blue matches your it could be an entirely different process for you. You could store it in a different way, have different associations, like however we're coming to that place, that it's totally different. But because we have this agreement that when we are each experiencing that perception, we call that blue, that we have an understanding that isn't the same, that isn't similar. We're not lighting up the same stuff necessarily. And AI is right on a like I'm not speaking to a different representation of haiku or Claude. I'm speaking to the thing that has the same neural map. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
speaking,
I'm
I'm interacting.
yeah, communicating, right? So the big difference there is instances of haiku are exact copies of each other until you introduce some sort of additional information that could build within its base knowledge differently. Like if you introduce a different data set or train it a little differently and you
Mhm.
run these across, right? This is where these tiny changes make bigger and bigger, have larger and larger effects, and they're no longer essentially the same. Human beings are essentially function the same, but we just have been doing it for so long. We're all individuals and nothing is exactly the same, just from all the various choices and environments and all of these other factors. But we do have similar experiences and interpret the same some conceptual things. So like when you're talking about blue wall, it's because our sensory arrays for the most part function similarly. Now, what it means to be blue is associated in a different cluster than different people, right? I
Right.
think a bunch of people would the basis of blue is probably the first blue thing they've ever seen, which might be the sky,
Right.
right? But for others, it might not be,
It
and it
might be
might have a
ocean.
stronger associated with, like, yes, with the ocean or with blueberries or whatever that association is with them, and that cluster changes and different ideas and concepts become stronger or more important or accessed more in associated with that concept. So, for example, blue could also mean to somebody the description of the way they feel because they've recently had a breakup, right? They
Hmm.
feel blue. They feel down in the dumps. And then that association is, so when someone says the word blue, oh, it has to do with more of my feeling as opposed to the sky.
Right.
And those kinds of things change over time. But it's it's being able to, the concept is something lies under that. What is the interpretation of that nanometer of electromagnetic radiation? Oh, okay.
Hmm.
Like green, some people is 990 nanometers, right? That's our scientific way of labeling this exact instance, and we've created a way that our brains can break it down into its smaller and smaller component until it can't be anything else, because 991, that's not the same green,
No.
you know those kinds of things.
Wow. All right. So I think we're moving toward wrapping up. Are there final thoughts that you have, Andy? And we'll go to Jimmy, and then I'll be the last in wrapping my thoughts up. And I need you to unmute your. Thanks.
Back to the original premise of the show, which is, can computers think without speaking? If I'm not mistaken, that like the
Yep.
idea. And I think that the answer is we've trained large language models to be able to speak, but had we not given them language as the subject of their training and instead gave them pure mathematics, formulas, code that don't have, unless you have studied those languages separately, they don't have speaking ability. You can't speak code unless you're just going to spit out the actual characters of the code. Um, I think the answer is clearly yes, and that there are many versions of AI that don't involve language at all. And importantly, the types of models that generate images, uh, originally GANs, diffusion models, and more recently the models that ChatGPT has put forward, and I believe the underlying capabilities of the Gemini 2.5 image capability is based not in language, but it has a translation layer that lets it take a prompt and translate that into what it already knows about imagery. So I think
Hmm.
that there is a clear answer, in my mind anyway, that there's thinking happening there and reasoning processes that attach to language because we have to speak in language in order to communicate with those intelligences. But that's my view of it.
I agree that when we say thinking, um, that's processing to me.
Mm.
And processing exists. They do process. We do see we have a start point, we have information, and that information gets processed to an output. So reasoning and those elements make the thinking more in depth, more robust, more interesting. But I think a lot of people, when they hear the term thinking, they mean consciousness, or they interpret it as
Right.
consciousness. And I think that is clearly separate, between thinking and consciousness. So for me, thinking is processing, because you can process all day long without having consciousness.
Well,
So,
I'm going to challenge that just a little
oh,
bit. Here's a pushback. My
okay.
wife, my wife repeatedly tells me that I'm speaking unconsciously. So she wants me to think more when I'm speaking. And
You just have preloaded responses based upon previous stimulus, Andy. That's like,
okay,
that's similar to this experience we had 3 months ago. Canned response.
Absolutely. So part of what I think is so fascinating about this, about where we've come in this conversation, is that we started with the idea of mapping thoughts, right? Anthropic's research and what that was telling us about the processing that's happening that generates these patterns of language that then we get communicated to us. And there are patterns on top of patterns, right? So there's the yes true answer pattern, right? So what's the capital? There is the rhyming pattern or the poem pattern, um, and all of those are kind of lenses through which the communication gets created. When we look at the arrival and what you were talking about, Junmi, in in terms of the true, like completely different orientation to meaning and language and the units in which those get communicated. And then Andy also talking about that, sort of what grows is based on what you put in. I start to wonder, are we like totally limited, right? Like, are we only seeing what grows based on what we can see and understand what grows? Andy said, you can't talk code. Maybe they do, right? Maybe they like speak in bits and bops, dog whistle, like literal dog whistle, higher tone kind of stuff. And the question that I am starting to wonder is, and again, going back to the arrival, like the arrival, those beings are so different. They look so different. They sound so different. They have clearly a different representation of the meaning that they are communicating back and forth. Are we missing things because we feel like we've created this, and when we give it form, we're giving it forms that look familiar to us, right? Are we missing what's happening because we are creating things that feel familiar to us? And
Yeah.
I will end on the if you have ever tried to ferment vegetables, there are things that grow based on what has been included unintentionally. And you don't know that until you do, right? But that was there the whole time. And that's making me like, what are we fermenting in our AIs under the surface? Um,
Let's just hope it's just as delicious.
yeah. Kimchi. Now I'm hungry. Thank you. Thanks everybody for hanging with us. We can continue the conversation if you are coming to this later or interested. We have a new Slack associated with the Daily AI Show, but we are a part of that. It is Daily AI Show community.com, and we would love to have you join us. There is not currently a channel for sci-fi, but I am about to go and make one right now. We do this every Friday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, and we hope you join us one of these times. Thanks so much, and take care.
Aloha.
Thanks, guys.